Hello, welcome everybody. Good morning. Lovely to see you on the line this morning. This is actually the last Property Master webinar of the year. As you know, we've been doing them pretty much monthly now for well over 18 months, certainly since the COVID crisis began and really began to bite. And we've tried really to use these occasions to keep you up to speed with what is happening in the buy-to-let mortgage market and the private rental sector in general. And we always have a guest with us. And I'm absolutely delighted this morning to welcome Chris Norris, who's Policy Director of the NRLA. Hi, Chris. NRLA, as you know, I'm sure you're all familiar with them. They do fantastic work. I'm a landlord and a member myself. And if you're not a member, you really ought to be. Enormously useful resources and a fantastic team there. So think of the questions you might want to ask Chris about what is going on in the landlord market at the moment. If you have any questions, please do pop them in the ask a question at the bottom, or if you're happier using the chat box, then that's absolutely fine as well. We will be recording today, so if you have to dip out at any time, you will be able to catch up on the recording later on. Always, as ever, joined by Property Master's Chief Executive, Angus Stewart. Good morning, Angus.
Morning, Chris.
How are you?
And morning, Chris. Yeah, I'm very good, thank you.
Good. As ever, I think we'll kick off, Angus, if that's okay with you. You usually give a little bit of an overview of what you're seeing in the market. And the theme of today really is what we've seen throughout the year and looking ahead a little bit to 2022. So it's a lot to ask, but, what are your thoughts and insights?
Okay, well, what a year it's been, everybody. I mean, you think this time last year, the first vaccines were being given to people. We were not allowed to have Christmas parties unless we were in 10 Downing Street, and apparently that's possible. Life in Christmas was looking a little miserable. I mean, if I remember rightly, we were allowed to meet for one day with some close family, and that was about it. So the rollouts happened with the vaccine. There's been lots of changes over the year. It looked as though it was getting quite a lot better, and certainly in the last couple of weeks, we've got this Omicron thing, which seems to be causing concern. But if we look at what's happened in the market, a year ago we were all talking about end of furlough, house prices falling probably. Lots of concern there. Stamp duty holidays were introduced, and guess what? House prices have gone shooting up. We had the end of the two stamp duties in June and September, and it's been a very interesting year, I think, for the property market. As I say, house prices have gone up pretty much everywhere, and rental demand has gone up as well. That's all good news for landlords. The other bit of good news, I think, for landlords is that interest rates have remained pretty much at rock bottom. I've never known them down at a base at 0.1%, and whilst we keep hearing and seeing some indications that there's likely to be some rate rises, I think Omicron coming along in the last couple of weeks has dampened the likelihood of a rate increase this month. I'd be quite surprised to see base going up. If you'd asked me, a few weeks ago, I was expecting an increase. I'm starting to see some of the rates on the market look as though they were going up, but here we are, and continued dampening there. I think the next Monetary Policy Committee is early February, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not we actually see a base rate rise then. But yeah, fascinating times. If we look at what's happened in the mortgage market,
I don't know that one.
And if we look at what's happening in the mortgage market, borrowing in October dropped to 1.6 billion, very much lower than the 9.3 billion we saw in September. Why is that? Well, that's the end of the stamp duty, and there was a big rush for things to happen when people could take advantage of the stamp duty holidays. House purchases got pulled forward. Approvals for remortgaging moved in the opposite direction by a small amount, 41,600 at 8.7 billion. So things are still moving along in this market reasonably well, and that's the highest number of mortgage approvals since March 2020. So since we started this pandemic, things are moving, things are continuing to go, And yeah, and certainly the remortgage market is continuing to be very buoyant, and lack of supply is the challenge in this market. Why are prices going up? Because there's a lack of demand, or there's a lack of supply there. There's huge demand, and we're continuing to see that. And I say, if we look a year or so ago, I think people being doom and gloom about what was going to happen under furlough and everything else, and prices wouldn't be buoyant, and we've got the opposite. And I think it shows how good everybody's crystal ball is at understanding what may or may not happen in a COVID driven market. I sit here and look at 2022. Well, I do see some interest rate rises. I do think there's going to be some. Quite how quickly they come, I think that's going to depend on what happens with this Omicron variant, whether it's the vaccines are proven to be effective against it. But I'm reasonably confident that we are stuck with COVID for many years to come. We're going to have to live with that in one guise or another. Our ways of life will change. We are going to continue to have vaccines. We are going to continue to be in a position where we can't let the world stop for that, and we need to learn to work out how we live with it. And that's to some extent a bit of a sanguine sort as we go into this exciting Christmas period. So 2022, I'm hoping, is going to be another good year for our landlords. It's going to be interesting to see what questions get raised and some of the comments that Chris can make on what he sees coming out from a policy and perspective over the next 12 months or so. So, Chris, back to you.
Thank you. Well, just to answer on demand. There does, as you say, there is strong demand for property, both to buy and to rent. And obviously, we're particularly interested in property to rent. What sort of property? Because there's been lots of speculation about how the housing market has changed in terms of what people want, more space and so on. But then we've also heard strong demand for flats. What are we seeing at Property Master?
I think we're seeing strong demand across the board. I mean, clearly during lockdown, there were a lot of family splits. There's been an increased demand for sort of single people homes during this period. We're seeing demand for stuff which is slightly more rural, where people can at least work from home, but they've got gardens. There is some evidence in terms of flats in certain locations. Even central London, which had a fair hit, there's some indications that demand is going back up again there slightly from where it was. So generally we're seeing improvements across the marketplace, but it will be. I think a lot of this is going to be driven by this hybrid working that we're seeing, and is here to stay.
Well, that certainly seems to be the case. Chris, also sort of picking up on the COVID theme now that we are facing new restrictions. I know from the work you guys have been done, there are still a lot of landlords struggling with rent arrears from the last lot of restrictions. What is the picture at the moment, and how do you see that changing now that we're going into yet another, not exactly lockdown, but some people won't be able to work in the way they would before?
That's very true. It's very challenging, and I think it's not exactly come as a surprise that we're facing more challenges now. But it is unfortunate when things were looking up, or at least beginning to. I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, you're absolutely right. There is an arrears problem out there in the marketplace, but I think actually it's perhaps, and maybe this is semantics, but it stopped short of being that arrears and that debt crisis that I think a lot of us have been talking about. So you've really got two facets to this. You've got overwhelmingly, the proportion of tenants who are in arrears is coming down. We've just completed some polling actually with private tenants, and those are private tenants that have nothing to do with our members, so it's not that kind of skew that we quite often get with our research, just free found private tenants. And actually back in the spring we saw about 7% of tenants were in arrears to one extent or another that had accrued during the COVID period. We've seen that halve. We're down to about 3.7% now who are in arrears. Now, the sting in the tail to that is, if you're in arrears, you're likely to be in much more arrears than you were previously. So we've seen that that mean arrears figure pretty much double, go from about £900, I think, to about, and I should have notes in front of me, but to about £1,700 now. So if you are affected, you're certainly affected a lot more than you have been. The good news is the majority of landlords, the majority of tenants overwhelmingly aren't actually affected. And actually what we're starting to see is it's beginning to look like a prolonged period of improved optimism. And one of the things we track when we do all our polling is we track optimism of landlords across a lot of different indices, but particularly their own business. And we're now seeing a 5-year high. Now, granted, those of us who've been around a little while will know the last 5 years have not been the most optimistic period. We've had a few challenges, would we say? But actually, we've seen from the doldrums of the first lockdown, the figure we use is net optimism. We saw net optimism drop to 18%, lowest we've ever seen, lower than the credit crunch, lower than Section 24 being announced by a long, long way. And we thought this could be really bad. Expectation was that the vast majority of landlords' incomes were going to be hit. About 85% thought they would be significantly hit. But actually, what we've seen is a straight line recovery in optimism. It's gone from 18%. We're only at about 48 now. It's not run away, but it's been a completely straight line. And we've seen that figure of impact, at least financial impact, drop from 80-odd% saying this is going to be bad for me to about 50% saying, yes, there's been a negative effect. And actually fewer than a third saying their finances have been hit. So it's obviously not been a good news period, but I think at the moment we're living up to that reputation of being a counter-cyclical market. We're living up to that reputation of being a marketplace that actually is quite dynamic and can respond to challenging times. And we're doing exactly that. So I think at the moment, Plan B doesn't include any particular lockdowns around the housing market. I think there's optimism to be drawn from that. We do have this short winter truce, as they call it, around eviction procedures, which people are trying to make out to be a COVID symptom. Actually, it's something that happens every year, but this is a COVID one for one reason or another. And we do have to bear in mind that the government has retained the ability to reintroduce those restrictions on the housing market, but they've chosen not to do it yet. So I think it's tentatively good news at the moment, and we'll just have to wait to see how Omicron, I'm getting the pronunciations wrong, rolls
People are
out.
often wondering how to pronounce it. Well, that's really comforting news and encouraging news. What do you think is fueling this optimism? Is it because we're not seeing these rent arrears building up, or is it the strength of the housing market, or is it a combination?
I think it's a combination of a few things. I think the overriding metric that we're monitoring is demand, and I think Angus said it before. We've now tracked increasing demand. So we track demand in two ways. We don't do live interest in property, but we do perceived demand from our members. And we've been tracking both high demand in terms of the perception our members have of their local marketplace and the increase in demand. And we've seen them both steadily ticking upwards. And actually, over the course of the pandemic restrictions, I think if you ignore maybe the first 2 quarters when the housing market was, of course, artificially stymied, since maybe September, October last year, we've seen this demand increasing, and we've been monitoring it in every area apart from Central London. And Central London, and potentially a little bit in our West Midland landlords, but we don't have quite enough data to dig down to see if that's a Birmingham phenomena or not. So kind of centre city areas we've seen as a lag factor on that demand. What we've seen in the last quarter, maybe quarter and a half, is that London's catching up, and actually it's catching up pretty quickly. We've not been able to do that deep dive to see what types of property it is in London yet. And I suspect actually we've still got a bit of an issue when it comes to the lower end of the market, when it comes to shared housing. But we're seeing really very high demand for, traditionally high demand parts of London. This
is really encouraging. What is this winter truce you talk about with regards to repossessions? How does that work? Well, it's a couple of weeks generally. I think it's going to be a week longer this year, probably because of COVID, when warrants for possession aren't traditionally carried out. So it's an instruction to bailiffs to not schedule any. It's normally about a week before Christmas and then just after New Year. Now, no one ever takes any notice of it normally because it's Christmas and practically everyone shuts down. There are a few landlords who are obviously affected because they desperately need to get possession, but no one really notices it. This year, because we had that extended, as they called it, truce last year, which never seemed to end or didn't end until about May,
I think lots of people were very worried when this started leaking
Okay.
out. We actually called up the Ministry of Justice, who kind of issue these directives at the time, and they were really quite confused as to what we were talking about, because it was business as usual. They'd just done what they do every year, and were quite surprised that they'd been picked up in some of the trade press. So we are watching that. I think there is a definite risk, and it wouldn't come as a shock if actually that moratorium on all but the most serious warrants continued for a little bit. We're not expecting it at the moment, but I don't think it would come as a shock. The thing that would have a bigger effect, I think, is if some of those other slightly more draconian restrictions on the housing market came back in. And we're having pretty much weekly dialogue with, what's the department's name now? DLUC, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities now, who are responsible for that, just to see where ministers are thinking. Because at the moment, there seems to be no intention to start to roll out longer notice periods or start putting up restrictions on. But we know they did retain that power. They don't need to go back and pass another act. So that's there waiting should anything happen. But I think everyone in government's really got their fingers quite tightly crossed that this might be, with this latest variant, the bridge from pandemic to endemic. And actually, whilst we'll have to be very careful, this could be the one that, whilst very infectious, isn't actually quite so dangerous, and therefore they might not need to do some of those more extreme measures.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, there have been a couple of surprisingly good, I don't know what the word would be, but nudges from government that they are more favourable, or certainly listening to what landlords have had to say. I mean, we expected Section 21 reform, didn't we, this year? It doesn't seem to have happened. Is that because they're thinking twice about it, or is it just they've not had the time, or it's not the right time to do it? What are you hearing from government at the moment?
I think it's more the latter two than the former, if I'm honest. I mean, you're right. This was announced all the way back by Theresa May. It would have been 2017, 2018. And we thought maybe when Boris Johnson, took up the helm, it might be something that took a back seat. You'll all remember it was reaffirmed in his Queen's speech. I think last year we just have to pretty much write off. I mean, I was beginning to work very closely with the team that was set up in what was then the ministry to start writing this legislation. They were disbanded. They were disbanded on day one of lockdown, and they were sent off to run essentially tiger teams, crisis management teams. And I felt quite sorry for the PRS lead, because she had two hats. She was trying to write all of this guidance for the COVID lockdowns and still keep one eye on what is the rental reform agenda. It hasn't gone away, though, and we're told repeatedly by ministers, it's still an ambition. I think what's really interesting, though, and again, maybe this is semantics, maybe this is rhetoric, but when it was reintroduced in the second of Johnson's Queen's speeches, the tone had changed. It had changed from a bill that was going to do X, Y, and Z, and it had become a white paper that was going to lead to a bill, and there'd be lots of engagement to work out exactly what would be in that bill. So I think the one thing that we can be, you can never be 100% certain, but the one thing we can be 90% certain of is that Section 21 will still go. I think the government are very, very alive, though, to what that does to the risk profile of tenants, and particularly the kind of tenants that they're now very conscious of in red wall constituencies. So I think what they're doing now is they're looking at what they need to do around antisocial behaviour. They're looking at what they need to do to give HMO landlords more confidence. It won't be no fault, but I think it will be different processes and different grounds, and we're working with them to try and develop that. I think there's also a bit of an internal battle going on between DLUC, as it is, the Ministry of Justice, and ironically the judiciary, who you'd think would be part of the Ministry of Justice, but of course we have this separation, trying to learn everything that they can, because nobody wants to say anything good came out of COVID, of course, but actually it's taught us a lot about efficiencies. And when it comes to the courts and the possession process, so much was closed down that it put so much pressure on that actually it's made everyone look at what can we do online, what can we do quicker, what can we do in an accelerated way or a paper-based way. So there's a lot of activity going into that. There's a lot of nudging of judges who really don't want to have the way they work changed at all. And I think all of that will have to feed into the bill. But the timing is going to be, so I know I've become a monologue here, but
no, it's fascinating to get these insights.
The timing of this, I think, is going to be really crucial, because we expected to see a bill last spring. That bill would work its way through the Houses of Parliament, probably become an act at the end of the year, probably could have been enacted this year. What we're looking at now is if we don't get a white paper, I would suggest until maybe the spring or early summer next year. That means at the earliest, we'll get a bill in the autumn. It's going to be quite a controversial bill. It's likely to be what we call a Christmas tree bill, because opposition parties can hang everything they want off of it because it's called housing. So that'll take a lot of time to get all the amendments sorted out. It'll probably end up passing through both houses by the spring of 23. Now, spring of 23, if you're a betting man or woman, might be when we have our next election. And it might be when we have our next prime minister, quite frankly, because at the moment, the current one doesn't seem to be doing so fantastically in the polls. So there's a lot of question marks about when it might actually be able to be implemented and if they'll carry the majority they need to get it implemented in the way they want to. So I think it's still going to happen, irrespective of the outcome of that election. We'll either get the agenda we're looking at the moment or potentially a different one, but it'll achieve some of the same things. But we're probably, if you're quite attached to Section 21, as I am, many of our members are, you're probably quite safe for the next couple of years. We're not going to see that go, but it's going to be interesting to watch how it works. To put it mildly,
it's very complex, and I think government, the nearer they get to it, the more they realise how complex this is. It's such a complex interplay of facts. And you mentioned antisocial behaviour, the way the courts operate. It's a bit of a hot potato. I mean, Angus, remember when we were talking about the 25 years since the buy-to-let mortgage market came about, and we were chatting about the legislative framework of which Section 21 was part. So, mucking about with that is a bit dangerous, isn't it?
Well, you mess about with things at your peril because you don't know whether you're going to introduce something worse. And I think the key thing you said there, Chris, is they're going to be concerned about the red wall seats. They want to make sure that they can get re-elected, and if they do too much, which causes anxiety amongst some of that population, they will. That's another way of losing that seat. So I think there's going to be care there. One other thing which we managed to miss by the skin of our teeth this year was a suggestion that stamp duty was going to go up to 4%. I mean, and it was in the Red Book, I believe, but then never got enacted. Do you have any insight on that, and whether that's something that landlords can look forward to with trepidation in a subsequent budget?
We can always look forward to more taxes, can't we? I don't think it made it. I don't think it made it quite as far as the Red Book. It got as far as the Office for Tax Simplification. Yeah. And I think there was a study of what the likely impact would be. So they tend to model all of these taxes before they make their way into the Red Book. And for once, the OTS's view was pretty much exactly the same as the argument that we were making. And I'm not claiming a victory on that, because we certainly, that wasn't us that influenced that. But they looked at it actually, and I suppose it was an implementation of the old Laffer curve. You can put taxes up to a certain amount, but after that it starts to drop away because it influences behaviour. And they deemed actually they'd make less money out of putting an extra percent onto that SDLT. I was quite surprised, because I thought actually that would be an easy win for them. As much as I absolutely loathe that policy and think it's an awful way to try and control activity in the market just by slapping another 3% on. I thought it had been an easy win for them, because frankly it didn't deter landlords when it was introduced.
Well, you saw the strong demand. You see,
exactly. So, and whenever we poll our members, keep this between ourselves, they don't really care a great deal about SDLT. It tends to be viewed just as an operating cost and something that when they come to exit many years later, well, it'll balance out in the wash, when I have my capital gain. So we don't tend to see landlords being influenced hugely by either stamp duty holidays, and this actually is where there's a distinction between the NRLA's type of landlord and new market entrants. We tend to see a great flurry in terms of people who've never invested in property before, hopefully talking to you guys and doing some research and understanding what it all means, but all too often not, and just running in and thinking I'll do that before the deadline. Whereas our members just tend to ignore it, and they've got their 10-year plan, and they'll invest when it's right for them and when they come across the right asset. And they take a similar view when it comes to the levy. I think the levy's not popular. Nobody wants to pay that. It's complicated at times, particularly for some smaller landlords who've only got one or two properties and aren't anticipating it. But it doesn't really tend to have a huge impact on their behaviour. So it maybe would have been an easier win for the government than that. I think the one that surprised us a little bit was capital gains. And we
Well,
really
that's
did
what I was
think.
just going to ask you, because we were all getting very worried, weren't we?
We were. I mean, I think the government did something very interesting and quite brave. And for those of us who are fans of Yes Minister, brave is never a good thing when it comes to political decisions. When they made the changes to NICs, to national insurance contributions, because that was a bit of an easy win for the opposition. You can say automatically you're taxing work, but you're leaving all those nasty landlords who are sat on the backside and doing nothing to carry on, bringing in the cash. So we genuinely thought, although we argued strongly against it, that the balancing of that seesaw would be, well, here we're going to bring CGT for property in line with income. And it was genuinely a surprise. And that's the bit, actually, I think, that didn't make it into the Red Book, but made it into the OBR, the Office for Budgetary Responsibilities analysis of the budget. I think they thought that had happened. And actually, they explained that as a typo afterwards. But it was, it was a proposal certainly behind the scenes, and it never quite made it there.
But is it going to come back? Is it going to come back, Christy?
Well, I think the government will be looking for any way they can to increase the receipts. I mean, that's just a no-brainer. I think this will be a very political decision. I think that Number 11 will be wanting to do this because it will balance out with certain constituencies. It will bring in a significant amount of money. I think the argument that we've made is similar to that on SDLT, in that actually you have to consider CGT as a slightly different type of fiscal lever. You can choose when you realise that gain. You don't have to realise the gain at any given point. And I think what they've got to be very careful of is that they don't force landlords, certainly a whole generation of ageing landlords, a lot of whom are in our membership, into hanging on to those assets longer than they need to, and hanging on to them to the point where they maybe can't afford to do some of the things that we need to in the future. So maybe some of the energy efficiency improvements, even down to straightforward maintenance. I mean, I often use this example, and I probably shouldn't because he's a lovely old chap, but we had a member, he's actually not with us anymore, up until a couple of years ago, who would call us up complaining that his tenants had been demanding maintenance work, and that he couldn't do it anymore because he was 95 and he'd always done his own maintenance and he refused to get a roofer in. And you'd have these protracted arguments telling him, well, I know you've always done it. I know you were a roofer, but you've got to pay for somebody else to do it. And he was exactly the type of individual, and there's no defending not doing the work, but he was exactly the kind of individual who'd hung on to property too long and should actually have been facilitated to get out of the market earlier on. And my worry when it comes to capital gains is you start to encourage some of that behaviour. And that's something we've got to be very careful of. So it's not just a fiscal issue. It's actually what it does to landlord behaviour that I think the government have got to be very aware of.
That's so interesting, because that seems to run counter to another thing we've talked about a lot, which is the increasing professionalisation of the landlord market, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, we see this is very crude, but we see a bit of an age divide, and we have we tend to. This isn't a terminology we've picked for public consumption, but we talk about lifestyle landlords and entrepreneurial landlords, and we tend to find that landlords who've come into the market maybe over the last 15 to 20 years have a slightly more entrepreneurial mindset. They've actively grown portfolios. They've quite often done it as a result of losing out in pension investment previously. And they've come in with maybe a 25-year plan, and it's really quite clear. Now, some of it's been thrown out by different policy changes and tax changes, but they have quite a business-like view. We tend to find, and this is a huge oversimplification, but an older generation of landlords who have been in the market for quite a lot longer, perhaps got in many cases in our membership in the 80s, some of them even before actually, or have inherited property that was already a going concern, have not a less professional outlook necessarily, but a more emotional tie to their business. And that tends to be the kind of dividing factor. So those newer, planned portfolios don't tend to have the emotional connection to the property. They're very black and white. They do their maintenance when it needs to be done. They've got schedules. They know that they need to cut out some of the poorly performing stock and replace it. Whereas I think some of the slightly older landlords, and it's not just an age thing, but that tends to be how it manifests in the membership, can have a slightly more emotional commitment to some of the portfolios. And whilst by and large, because you don't have to join us, they are the better landlords, and they are perfectly legally compliant and do everything they need to do, they approach it a bit more differently, and perhaps there's a little more resentment at times, particularly when it comes to legal change.
I mean, Angus, what about? I don't know. We're fairly new. We've only been around a few years, but even in that time since you launched Property Master, have you seen the type of landlords change that you are dealing with?
We've got a range of customers with a range of different interests, but I recognise what Chris is saying there in terms of landlords with sizable portfolios who are running it as a proper business, as opposed to those that inherited property many years ago and have that emotional connection. So I do see that. I mean, and clearly you've got other landlords who've only got 1 or 2 properties, and some of them are accidentally in this space and may not be seeing it as a business, but it's just an additional savings mechanism for them towards their pension. So you do get different views from landlords in terms of what they're trying to do. But I do see a growing, I don't know whether professionalisation probably is the right word, but growing size of portfolio. And we're seeing people who are maybe they're the entrepreneurial types that Chris is describing, who are slowly increasing the size of their portfolio. They recognise where they go. They do have a business plan which says, I will acquire 1 or 2 properties every year and expand what I'm doing. And you can see that relentless change in shape of market as people with 1s and 2s are dropping out, maybe getting fed up with some of the legislation, some of the pressures on them. And you've got these entrepreneurial guys who are saying, well, yes, I can see the opportunity there. I know that there are lots of constraints in the market, and the government's put all sorts of things in over the last 5 years, which makes it more difficult for me as a landlord, but I can still see my way through, and I can still see that it can be profitable. And I think we do see that. I do think there's going to be some interesting stuff coming in over the next few years. I mean, it's probably worth turning the conversation to EPC and some of the stuff that's happening there. I mean, and I'm concerned, Chris, that you've got the government driving us to do things by EPC. EPC is a measure of cost rather than carbon. And are our landlords going to get pushed to do the wrong things for the wrong reason, even though because they're being driven by an EPC that's cost driven, when the need for the environment and what everybody's expecting is something that actually improves the carbon position?
You're spot on. You're absolutely spot on. I mean, the EPC actually contains 2 measures that nobody ever takes any notice of. It contains something called the EER, which is I'm going to forget what all these acronyms stand for, but is the element that looks at cost. And you're quite right. That's the headline that's on the front of that EPC that we're all driving towards, whether that's an E or a C. There's also a measure in there called the EIR, which really contradictorily the government were trying to kind of mothball. But actually, it's what we're going to have to move towards, and I think it'll be drawn to a head because you've got 2 governments within the UK who are looking at this very differently. You've got the Welsh government and you've got the Westminster government, and I think the Welsh government might be a step ahead at the moment in terms of making that switch. It's pretty much inevitable at some point in the next few years. We've got to move from looking at EER and cost and moving on to EIR and carbon, but we need lots of kind of iterative decisions and announcements to be made in the way, and the government in Westminster have been really reluctant to make some of those. So I think those of you with properties like the one I'm sat in right now, actually, which are solid wall and single skin and would be very difficult to bring up to a C, will be aware that we're waiting for this response to a government consultation, the MEES consultation, Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards in Private Rented Property, which we expected actually back in the spring. Then we were pretty sure was going to come out with the heat and building strategy in October or November when that was finally released. And actually all we got was a statement saying, we've not got it here, but we'll announce it before the end of the year. Now, my suspicion sat here on the 10th of December is we're not going to see that by the end of the year. In fact, the kind of insider knowledge that we got was that BAYS, the department responsible, had written that response and had sent it to number 10, and number 10 was sat on it. And they sat on it for 4 or 5 weeks. And then the next time we followed up, we were told the entire team that wrote it had been sent on an away day to discuss how we can transition different tenures to higher ratings. Now, putting 2 and 2 together and maybe getting 5 That to me looks like number 10 read what Bayes wanted to do, said, no, we don't like that. Go away and think about it again. And we'll see something in the new year. I think it's inevitable that we will see the next step being C. I think it's inevitable that the cost cap will go up. But I think actually they need to look very carefully at what the exemptions look like for properties for them, how that cap can be potentially tiered to take into account the vastly different asset value of properties, up and down the country, and how can it possibly be fair to have a £10,000 cap on a £2 million property in the southeast and the same £10,000 cap on a £50,000 property in a post-industrial town in the northeast? I think they've got to look at how that works, and they've also got to look at what steps they take to get us to a decarbonised position before we switch from EER to EIR. Because one of the really confusing elements we've got is we suspect that had the response that the government had prepared been published, it would have actually continued to drive people towards more efficient gas appliances. At the same time, the government is talking about phasing out gas. And how on earth can we as a landlords association, for instance, tell our members, best thing you can do to get an EPCC is to get a hyper efficient combi gas boiler now. But by the way, in 2026, there's a fairly good chance they might start phasing those out when you expect that appliance to have a 12-year lifespan. We need decisions on hydrogen, yet we're told the hydrogen strategy won't be announced until 2026, potentially a year after landlords have got to get to C. And we don't know about any of the kind of preferred technology decisions that are going to be made, because as much as it's very nice to talk in the media about air source heat pumps, they're fantastic for new build properties. They're not so fantastic for Victorian places like I'm sat in now, where it would cost upwards of £30,000 or £40,000 to do that retrofit. So there's a huge amount of things we need to get from the government before we can start moving forward. And I think the awkward position we're in as an industry is I can't in good faith tell my members to go and do anything beyond insulation. I think insulation's a fair bet. Go and make your house, your flat as energy efficient as you can. But when it comes to what kind of carbon or decarbonised heating system you're going to have in there, we just need more data.
So at the moment, that would be the advice, because that we've all seen the stories. There was a recent survey suggesting more than half of landlords that own less eco-friendly homes are considering selling up because they are worried about this train coming down the track. So what would your advice be to them?
That's a slightly misleading stat, if I'm being pedantic.
I'm quoting the media.
it was one of ours, and it was taken a little bit out of context. But you're absolutely right. There is a significant cohort, out there that would consider leaving the market. What that survey, that polling actually said was that we had about half of landlords who thought they would have no problem getting all their properties up to a C by 2028, which is the kind of backstop deadline. It said of the others, about half and half would have some problem with some property, and about 27% said, actually, we don't think we're going to be able to get any of our properties up to that standard. What we then had, and where we weren't probably clear enough when we pushed this out, half of that 27% said, no, I've got no alternative but to leave the market. So we're still talking about a significant cohort of landlords. We're probably talking about 10 to 15% of landlords who've got poorly performing property at the moment, who actually don't think there's any alternative other than sell up. But it's not quite the half of landlords will exit, which it's probably our fault it was taken out of context, but it was taken out of context a little bit. But there is that significant group, and I think we've got a bit of a breakdown. We've got some really interesting decisions being made about new property coming to the market. And certainly our members tell us they're very, very unlikely now to buy any stock that has an EPC lower than a C. And if they do, it's because they've got a plan there and then on acquisition to retrofit before tenants even go in. So that we've got enough information for the new acquisition to get to a C at least. I mean, don't even get started on what happens when we have to get to an A, because that's a bigger question. What we don't have any answers for, though, is what happens to the somewhere between a third and a half of stock that's already in the sector that isn't at a C yet. Now, most of it's at a D, and a lot of Ds can, with some underfloor insulation, with loft insulation, with relatively minor retrofit, get up to a low C. But some certainly can't, and some need really wholesale, we call it deep retrofit. And that's the kind of thing that involves external wall insulation, that maybe involves solar PV, or might involve, at the moment, a heat pump. Although we'd much rather look at a hydrogen combi if we got a decision on that in the future.
So it is wait and see at the moment, but do what you can, do the sensible things, like, as you say, insulation, but don't spend huge amounts of money at the moment, because we don't quite know how this is going to be measured.
Yeah.
I would say it's difficult now. It reminds me a lot of, do you remember the boiler scrappage scheme a few years ago? Reminds me a lot about that, because we had lots of landlords who took advantage of that, and it was very good at the time, but they were driven towards a particular technology. And then a few years later, the regs on kind of flow temp on those boilers changed, and actually we were starting to be nudged towards a slightly different direction. And now, only about 10 years on, so sorry, hitting my mic there, the lifespan of those appliances, we're already being told, well, actually, that might not be the future anymore, and you might have to rip that out. And what we found was we had lots of landlords who had been really reluctant to go to combis because of their reliability issues, ripped out header tanks, ripped out piping, that they're now being told they've got to reinstall because heat pumps require a header tank and require all of that piping. So what we are really trying to avoid right now is landlords making very long-term decisions based on a technology that might not be suitable. And it's a big question mark in that. And it's going to become more and more difficult over the next couple of years, because if we do see the government stick to their 2025 or possibly 2026 target, and we do see them stick to not telling us what's going to happen about a potential decarbonisation of the gas grid until about the same time, landlords are going to have to make some decisions. But I think for the time being, you're probably okay to stick with the technology you've been working with now. As Angus said, hit that C as best you can, even if your carbon output isn't fantastic. And then hopefully we'll get enough information to be able to make those longer term decisions.
Chris,
Angus, I know you're following this so closely. What's your view, and what are you seeing with lenders as well?
A couple of things. Well, firstly, is there a risk that they change the calculation approach? So what is currently a C for cost reasons might turn into a property that's a D or an E because it's not carbon efficient. And is there a risk that landlords are suddenly going to get misled and things will change downstream? Because I know that the way the EPCs calculate today, they do change those bases of calculations every now and again.
They do.
And I'm just a bit concerned that we've got people buying Cs thinking they're okay, and then finding that maybe it's not a C when something happens at the next recalculation of that APC. I mean, is that a risk we face?
I think there's a couple of risks in there. I mean, I think at the moment you could buy a C, have a new EPC carried out the next day, and find out it's a B or a D, depending on who turns up to do it. I mean, that's one of the really ridiculous things around the DEA process we have for doing these assessments, is based on lots of assumptions. And you can come into a property and be told it's got cavity wall insulation, and maybe the assessor says, okay, yeah, you've told me that, or you've shown me a receipt which might have dubious origins. Another one might come in and say, no, unless I drill a hole in your wall and I see there's insulation there, I'm going to assume it's not got it, and I mark you right down. So there's a huge amount of risk at the moment anyway around that. The second point is, you're absolutely right that the process, it's called RDSAP, Reduced Data Standard Assessment Procedure, is revised very frequently, and we're expecting the 11th version of RDSAP next year. And that could, the intention is to make it more consistent, but in doing so, it could actually drop a lot of properties were they to be assessed again down a band. Now, of course, we don't have a requirement to get a new EPC just because the calculation changes a little bit, so that's a bit of an issue. But makes it less of an issue. The bigger problem we've got is exactly as we were saying before, if, or as I probably believe when, we do switch from a rating that's based on cost towards a rating that's based on carbon. And I think that is inevitable and down the line. And what the government's got to do very, very carefully is not drop all of those legacy scores completely off the table and say, now you've got to work towards, at the moment, it's that blue chart on the back of the EPC that nobody takes any notice of. I think that's what we are going to move towards. And, any of you watching today, take a look at your EPCs. There can be quite a big difference between that colourful chart on the front and the blue chart on the back. And it's that one on the back that I think in the future we will have to pay a lot more attention to. My hope is that what we do is we get all of our provisions in the right order, and the government commits to decarbonising the grid, and actually that automatically drops our properties down, because they're already decarbonising the electricity grid. Now that will take decades, but it's a process that's in play. So anyone who's got electric heating or has perhaps not as efficient an installation as they need will see their carbon score come down because of that decarbonisation. If we do get a commitment to decarbonising the gas grid, and that is switching from natural gas to hydrogen, actually it makes it much, much easier to hit that carbon score. And actually it makes it much less about external wall insulation, which is prohibitive to lots of properties, and makes it more about the grid that you buy into than actually the installations you've got in the properties.
Yeah, I think the other thing that concerns me is lenders are being encouraged or are expected by government to change their portfolio of lending to be much more C and above. And we're seeing lots of green mortgages being introduced at the moment in an attempt to encourage not only landlords to, and it's not even just landlords, it's just homeowners to do something about their properties, and they'll get better deals on here. But again, this is an artificial situation where, if lenders are saying, well, half their portfolio by a certain date needs to be C or above, and that measure is wrong, we're going to find that it all backfires in 5 years' time.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's diesel all over again, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the comparison I make. It's being driven towards that efficiency score. I mean, I find green mortgages fascinating at the moment, because we've been looking at how we can incentivize and facilitate some of these changes. And when you've got a marketplace that is competing around 0.9%, I'm fascinated to see where some of the deals or where some of the discounting could possibly come from, because we're told by government, when we say we need access to better financing, we need access to better funding, they throw back at us, well, green mortgages, green loans. And actually at the moment, I mean, particularly if you've not got a huge amount of capital in your portfolio, which lots of landlords won't have, the prospect of being able to take out a loan to do some of this work at a preferential rate just seems completely alien to what's out there in the market at the moment.
Right, we're actually just running over time here. So if you do have any questions, do put them in the ask a question box or in the chat box. I have had some interaction with you guys, so I know you're there, but it sounds like you're drinking it all in. But just to close really for the day, looking ahead to 2022. So let's put our experts on the spot, Angus. So 2022 for landlords, good year or bad year, do you think?
I think we're going to see some increase in interest rates. I mean, at long last, I think there will be some increase there. So if one calls that bad news for landlords, because there's going to be increased cost without all the benefits of being able to offset the interest against the tax the way you used to a few years ago. So that's not great. But do I think it's going to be a very significant increase? No, I think it's going to be a slow and gradual increase in rate. I still think we're going to see quite a lot of competition in this marketplace. I think the opportunities for landlords continue to grow. I mean, we've got, the private rented sector is growing as a whole. There is still increased significant demand there. I think, as we talked about before, the issue there is one of supply and the cost of that supply in terms of property prices going up. But I think on the whole, it will be a reasonable year for landlords if we can dodge bullets on some of these other things. I think it'd be great if landlords could get some clarity on what they really should be doing with these EPCs and the Cs, and because none of us want to invest in something that we subsequently find that is a complete waste of money. And some of those investments, especially for some of the smaller or lower value properties, as you were saying, Chris, if you've got a property in the north that's £100,000 and you're being asked to spend 10 grand on it, making it greener, to just get an EPC from a D to a C, it's not worth the investment. It probably isn't worth the investment. And I think it's how do we get that balance right?
Been interesting to see how this issue has grown in significance throughout this year, hasn't it? I remember when we started off at the start of the year, Angus, I was like, how big an issue is this going to be, Angus? And you were always right in saying it would be. And as we got to the end of the year, it's just got bigger and bigger. So that's one to watch out for. What about you, Chris? Do you think it's going to be a good year? What's your view?
I think overridingly it'll be a good year. I agree with what Angus said there. I think we'll start to see some creep in interest rates, but I don't think we'll see a spike significant enough to really have too much of a knock on with landlords. I mean, we tend to think our members are shielded up to about 3.5% on the base rate. So although that will change a little bit because of the impact of Section 24 and the amount to which you can offset, but we think we're okay for the first couple of percentage rise that could take a good few years to get to. So I think that's good. I think it will be a challenging year, but a year that hopefully we get some clarity. We'll start to see what the route map looks like for rental reform. We will hopefully, as Angus said, get some clarity on what we need to do around some of these energy efficiency scores. And whilst that won't be popular, I think it'll be good for landlords, certainly those professionally planning the future of their portfolios, to know what they need to do and to be able to get on with it. And I think that's what they're really waiting for at the moment, certainly with their engagements with us. And as I said before, we are pretty much counter-cyclical. I think we're going to see slow economic growth, and that generally is good for landlords whose tenants are putting off big decisions and would rather rent for a little while and perhaps check out different areas. So that's good for us. The kind of shadow on the horizon, I suppose, for us, I think, is inflation. And we're starting to see the cost of doing business increasing. So not even just property inflation. We're starting to see landlords spending a larger proportion of their expenditure or their revenue on maintenance. And that's only creeped up a few percentage points. But I think we're starting to see scarcity of tradespeople. We're starting to see certainly inflation in material cost. And that's all dripping through. And if we add to that impetus to do more energy efficiency improvements, I mean, that could start to have a knock on. So that's our concern, I think. There'll be challenges with the regulatory changes, but our concern, I think, is just in costs of doing business.
Interesting. And of course, that affects our tenants as well in terms of the cost of living generally. So you're right to raise the spectre of inflation, which we haven't had to raise over the last few years. No. Thank you so much for your time, Chris and Angus. And thank you, everyone on the line today. We will send out the recording subsequently, and have a wonderful Christmas and a very happy and prosperous new year. I think our guests have given us lots to think about and lots to be confident about as well. Thank you very much.